At 10:16 a.m. on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea was a sheet of hammered steel. Captain Paul Pappy Gunn's B-25 Mitchell was skimming it at barely 200 feet. The waves were so close he could see individual whitecaps flick past under the nose. Salt spray hammered the underside of the fuselage. The engines screamed at combat power, prop tips scything the air inches from red line. Ahead, a Japanese transport filled his windshield. 8,000 tons of steel and men, pushing a white bow wave through the sea, decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Black puffs dotted the sky where other bombers had met the convoy's flak. Gunn didn't have a bombardier in the glass nose anymore. Where the man used to sit, there was nothing but guns. 450 caliber Brownings jammed into the nose on a steel frame. 4 more in cheek pods on the fuselage, 2 in the top turret, now cranked forward, 2 more on the sides, 14 guns, all pointing straight ahead. The 5th Air Force engineers back in Ohio had called this airplane impossible. Nose-heavy, unbalanced, would not fly properly. They'd recommended grounding everyone just like it. Right now, the impossible gunship was eating the sky. "Coming up on the outer screen," his co-pilot shouted over the roar. "Destroyer! Starboard!" Off to the right, a Japanese destroyer swung its bow to meet them, guns already spitting tracers. Lines of green and red fire laced the air. Some went high, some went low. A few streaked straight past the cockpit. The sound was like handfuls of gravel thrown against a tin roof. Pappy kept the nose down. He needed speed, not altitude. The Mitchell thumped along over the wave tops, its huge wing throwing a bow wave of air that rippled the sea. "Gun's hot," he barked. In the nose compartment, where once a bombardier had lain prone with a Norden sight, the new gunner braced his boots and wrapped his hands on the handles of 450s. Belts of brass and steel rattled in their guides. "Ready?" came the reply. The transport loomed larger. He could see men on deck now, tiny, frantically moving stick figures around the forward guns. Black puffs of medium flak blossomed above, too high. The Japanese gunners were still aiming for bombers at 10,000 feet. They hadn't yet understood that the real danger was coming at masthead height. The B-25 hit turbulence off the ship's bow wave and bounced. Gunn corrected instantly, hauling back just enough to keep the props out of the spray. They were maybe 150 feet up now, maybe less. "Now," he said. The nose erupted in flame. 14 50 calibers spat a continuous, ravenous stream of fire. The sound inside the aircraft was beyond hearing, a solid concussion in the chest. Spent cases poured out in a golden waterfall from the ejection chutes, clattering along the belly and vanishing into the sea. On the transport's deck, the effect was apocalyptic. Deck gunners were still swinging their weapons when 50 caliber slugs started walking up the bow, chewing through railings, men, and gun shields. A forward 25mm mount vanished in a shower of sparks and flying bodies. A line of tracers stitched across the bridge windows, turning glass and flesh into mist. Gunn held the trigger. At 250 yards, the transport filled the world. At 200, the nose dipped again. They were so low now he could see individual faces under helmets, arms thrown up against an invisible scythe. "Bombs!" the co-pilot yelled. Gunn flicked his eyes down for the barest instant. The skip bombing site, a simple grease pencil cross on the windscreen, lined up with the transport's waterline. This was the moment he'd built this monster for, to get a bomber low enough, alive enough, that skip bombing could work. He steadied his hand on the yoke, feeling the nose want to dig. The weight of the guns and ammo still pulled forward, fighting him. One wrong move and they'd plow into the trough ahead of the ship. "Steady," he muttered, "steady." Above them, somewhere in clean, safe air, the engineers at Wright Field had their slide rules and their balances and their technical reports saying this pass should be impossible. Down here, 150 feet over a hostile sea, there was no time for theory. There was only the deck of a Japanese transport rushing up at 240 knots, 4 bombs waiting in the bay, and a man whose wife and 4 children were behind barbed wire in Manila. He thumbed the bomb release. The B-25 lurched lighter. K-shapes dropped, kissed the water. skipped once, twice, like stones thrown low and hard across a pond, then slammed into the transport's flank just below the superstructure. The world ahead went white-orange. Gunn yanked back on the yoke as a wall of fire and smoke boiled up to meet them, and for a heartbeat, the impossible gunship disappeared into its own explosion. Cut to black. To understand how a medium bomber became a flying destroyer, you have to start with the man the Australians nicknamed Pappy. Paul B. Gunn was 43 in 1942. In a service full of 20-something hotshots, he was a gray-haired anomaly with crow's feet and grease under his fingernails. He had spent 21 years in the U.S. Navy before the war, most of them turning wrenches as well as flying. He moved easily between cockpit and maintenance stand, as comfortable with a micrometer as with a control yoke. Before Pearl Harbor, he'd been a civilian Pan Am pilot in the Philippines, flying the Manila, Australia run. When the Japanese attacked, his world collapsed in days. Manila fell. His wife and 4 children were trapped on the wrong side of the lines, swallowed into a Japanese prison camp. Gunn got out, barely. He flew evac runs under fire. He pulled wrecks off jungle strips and coaxed them back into the air. In one early episode, he'd reportedly ripped machine guns out of wrecked fighters and slapped them into the noses of bombers with almost no paperwork, because there simply wasn't time. By mid-1942, he wore an Army Air Force's uniform, but he never quite behaved like a typical staff officer. He'd appear at forward strips in oil-stained khakis, hands deep in engine cowlings, arguing with crew chiefs about fuel mixtures and manifold pressures. He'd also seen enough war, fast enough, to know that the manuals weren't keeping up. The 5th Air Force in Australia, including the 3rd Attack Group with their Douglas A-20 Havocs, was getting hammered. Japanese convoys threaded up through the Bismarck Sea and around New Guinea almost at will, putting troops and supplies ashore where MacArthur's men could least afford them. On paper, American bombers were supposed to stop them. On paper, that meant high-altitude bombing, 12,000 feet, neat formations, carefully calculated bomb runs. In reality, it meant watching sticks of bombs march tidily into empty water while Japanese transports zigged and zagged, then hearing over the radio as the defending escort gunners took revenge on the vulnerable bombers. In July alone, the 3rd Attack Group lost 11 A-20s trying to hit moving ships. 11. Crews burned alive or hit the water at full speed, leaving only floating wreckage and oil slicks. Captain Ed Leaner, one of Gunn's contemporaries, had watched 3 of his crews die in the Coral Sea in a single week. He'd sat on an overturned fuel drum afterward, helmet still on, hands locked, staring at nothing. "The bombers can't hit 'em," he said hoarsely to Gunn that day. "And when they go low, the deck guns chew them to pieces. We can't win this way." The standard answers were the same in every theater. Improved training, tightened formations, more fighters for escort. None of that changed the basic geometry. A medium bomber flying straight and level at 10,000 feet against a ship that could maneuver and throw up walls of flak from every angle. Gunn came at the problem the way an old mechanic does, with a mix of practical experience and disrespect for factory instructions. If the bombs weren't accurate from altitude, change the way you dropped them. If the approach was too deadly, change the way you came in. He'd seen kids skip flat rocks across farm ponds back home. He'd watched practice bombs skip when dropped too low at the wrong angle. He knew the physics were brutal but simple. Enough speed, a shallow angle, and a bomb would bounce off the water and still hit hard enough to kill a ship. Skip bombing wasn't in the manual yet. Neither was using a medium bomber like a giant strafing fighter. But nothing in the Pacific in 1942 was going by the book anyway. At Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, surrounded by rows of tired aircraft and a jungle of parts cannibalized from wrecks, Pappy Gunn looked at a Douglas A-20 Havoc and saw not the airplane the factory had sent, but the one he needed it to be. The Havoc had 430 caliber machine guns in the nose. Against unarmored trucks or buildings, they were fine. Against a ship's decks and shields, they might as well be throwing gravel. He needed 50s, heavy Brownings, fighter guns. The supply depots didn't have spare 50s sitting in crates, but the revetments held something else. Shattered P-39s and P-40s that would never fly again, and their guns were still good. The pilots were dead. The weapons weren't. Gunn was not sentiment, all about scrap metal. He started dragging Brownings out of wrecked fighters and into the nose of an A-20, where the bombardier used to sit, where a Norden bomb site had once occupied pride of place. Welders now lowered a steel frame built to take the recoil of 4 heavy machine guns. The idea was ugly, crude, heavy. It was also in the calculus of New Guinea and the Coral Sea, a way for more Americans to come home alive and more Japanese ships to die. Doctrine said otherwise. Engineers' textbooks said otherwise. Pappy Gunn was already learning to ignore both. The official term was operational losses. The men had other words for it. A-20. Havocs came back to Port Moresby and Milne Bay pocked with shrapnel, oil streaming from wounded engines, sometimes on one wheel, sometimes not at all. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. On a clear July morning in 1942, 9 A-20s from the 3rd Attack Group climbed out to hit a Japanese convoy slipping along the New Guinea coast. They found the ships easily enough, gray shapes spread out against darker gray water. The bomb run was perfect by the book, altitude steady, airspeed set, bombardiers peering into their sights as the formations bored straight and level into flak. They dropped on signal. Neat strings of bombs cascaded down, beautifully spaced. Most of them walked across empty ocean, some splashing in the convoy's wake. One bomb hit close enough to toss spray on a merchantman's bow, but not enough to gut her. The Japanese, now fully awake, filled the sky with black bursts and tracer. 2 A-20s took direct hits. One folded abruptly, wing shearing off, spinning into the sea, trailing fire. The other climbed for a second, then nosed straight down and disappeared in a tall white splash. A third limped away, on fire, losing altitude. Its pilot crash-landed in the water near shore. Some crew made it out of the wreck. Japanese escort vessels fanned out to rescue them. None were heard from again. Back at base, Ed Lehner paced the debriefing tent like a caged thing. His men filled out forms listing bomb settings, headings, estimated damage. The words looked neat and meaningless on the paper. Gunn watched him from the doorway. "They gave us everything we asked for," Lehner spat finally. "More time on the range, better sights, practice, and look where it got us." He jerked his head toward the runway, where ambulances were just pulling away from one battered A-20, its nose crushed. "You drop for earn on that height, on ships that can maneuver. In this weather, you're gambling." "What would you do?" Gunn asked quietly. "Hell if I know," Lehner shot back. "But I know this isn't it." Later that week, another shipping strike went in marginally lower, trying to improve accuracy. Crews dropped from 5,000 feet. They hit closer, but close still wasn't enough. The Japanese learned faster than the manuals did. They thickened their deck gunnery. They camouflaged ships against the background. The price stayed the same. Aircraft in the sea, empty seats in the mess tent at night. The core problem was a triangle Gunn couldn't stop turning over in his head. Height meant safety, but no accuracy. Low meant accuracy, but suicidal exposure to deck guns. Medium altitudes meant you got the worst of both. Skip bombing, getting in at 200 to 300 feet and skimming bombs into a ship, could solve half the triangle. The bombs would hit, but to get that low, the attacking aircraft had to live through those last 30 seconds. Standard A-20s and B-25s, dropping down through the flak with a few nose guns and a couple of flexible positions, simply couldn't suppress all the fire coming off a Japanese convoy. Every second on the approach was an invitation for every gunner on every transport and escort to pour fire into you. Gunn's idea was brutally straightforward. Flip the firepower equation. If you couldn't dodge the deck guns, drown them. Take a medium bomber. Strip out the refined, fragile bombardier's station. Turn that nose into a gun platform. Give the pilot forward-firing firepower like a squadron of fighters. Come in at masthead height. Hose the decks on the way in. Kill the gunners before they could kill you. Then, over the last few seconds, let the bombs go like skipping stones. To most men raised on precise Norden sight, tables and parade ground bombing patterns, it sounded insane. To those who'd watched 11 A-20s die in a month, it sounded like something that might just work. At Eagle Farm, in the damp morning light of August 17, 1942, Gunn watched mechanics weld the future into the nose of an A-20. 50 caliber barrels protruded like the fangs of some blunt-nosed predator. When the first test pilot took it up, loaded with 4 guns and 200 pounds of ammunition, the Havoc practically dragged its nose in the dirt on takeoff. The center of gravity had lunged forward. The airplane fought the stick, wanting to dive. The pilot came back white-knuckled and furious. "She wants to bury herself," he snapped, climbing down. "You've built a damned anvil on the front." Gunn didn't argue. He just started moving weight rearward. Oxygen bottles, radios, anything not nailed down.
The trim was adjusted. Fuel was distributed. 2 days of sleepless tweaking later, the second test pilot brought the modified A-20 back with a grin like a split in his face. "She flies like she's angry," the man said. "But she flies." On September 12th, 16 of those angry A-20s came in at treetop height over the Japanese airfield at Buna. Guns hammering, they roared down the runway line, 50s raking parked aircraft, trucks, gun pits. Bombs followed at low level, detonating among revetments. 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground. Every flak position along the strip suppressed or silenced. Not one A-20 was lost. It was the first hard proof that Pappy's ugly idea, bombers as strafers, could work. But the A-20's range was short. To reach farther, to hit convoys on the other side of the Owen Stanleys, to ride out and maul them day after day, he needed something bigger. The North American B-25 Mitchell was waiting. The B-25C was never supposed to be a gunship. In North Americans' brochures and the Air Corps' manuals, it was a medium bomber, crew of 6, glazed nose for the bombardier, internal bay for 3,000 pounds of bombs, a few defensive guns to ward off fighters. On the line in Australia, where the 81st Air Depot Group sweated over wounded aircraft in open-sided sheds at Townsville, it was something else, a big, sturdy platform with space to spare, and a nose just begging to be weaponized. By December 1942, Gunn had already proven his point on the smaller A-20. Buna's wrecked aircraft and dead gunners were testimony enough. Now he wanted that effect at longer range and with more teeth. He pulled the bombardier and original nose guns from a B-25C. The glazed nose, that elegant bubble meant for a man with a bomb sight, was gutted. In its place, steel framing and armor plate went in. 4 50s in the nose, fired by the pilot or nose gunner. 4 more in external cheek packs bolted to either side of the fuselage. The top turret, normally aimed at fighters coming from above and behind, was cranked forward so that its twin 50s could join the barrage. Then, because there was still space and Pappy's imagination didn't know when to stop, they added 2 more fixed guns, 1 on each side, fired by the co-pilot or extra crewman to rake ships on the beam at point-blank range. 14 heavy machine guns, all throwing metal forward. At 850 rounds per minute per gun, that was roughly 215 pounds of lead per second when everything was firing, not counting any bombs. Ground crews shook their heads and laughed nervously. Pappy's Folly, they called it, half joke, half warning. The numbers worried even Gunn. Each 50 weighed about 64 pounds, not counting ammo. 14 guns and their ammunition shifted the B-25's weight balance dramatically forward. The nose, which had once housed 1 man, and some optics, now held a small armory. The prototype's first takeoff was a near disaster. Loaded with fuel, ammo, and 4 500-pound bombs, the nose-heavy B-25 thundered down the steel-matted strip at Eagle Farm. At rotation speed, the pilot eased back on the yoke. Nothing. He hauled harder. The control column came back, but the nose barely lightened. The tail lifted lazily. The end of the strip rushed up. At the last instant, the Mitchell muscled itself into the air, wheels brushing the grass beyond the matting. The pilot kept both hands white-knuckled on the yoke, hauling for every foot of climb. When he brought it back, he climbed down furious and shaking, much as the A-20 pilot had. "She wants to die nose down," he told Gunn. "You fight her the whole way. You sure this is worth it?" Pappy looked up at the prowling shape of the B-25. He saw not a bomber that wanted to die, but a destroyer that hadn't quite found its trim yet. "Yeah," he said simply. "It's worth it." Again, there were days of adjustments. Ballast moved aft, equipment relocated, trim settings altered, crews learned new takeoff techniques, more speed before rotation, more assertive back pressure. When Gunn himself flew the refined prototype to Charter's Towers to show the 3rd Attack Group what he'd built, the nose still felt heavy. The B-25 still wanted to drop out of the sky on takeoff. He had to use full back pressure on the stick just to hold level until he had speed. The airplane flew angry, but once airborne, leveled off, and pointed at a target, it was everything he'd imagined. Push the throttles up, line the nose, hit the trigger. The whole aircraft became a forward-aim storm. The pilot wasn't just flying a bomber anymore. He was driving a 20-ton shotgun. General George Kenney, the new 5th Air Force commander, watched one demonstration and ordered 12 more conversions immediately. The 81st Air Depot Group went to 18-hour days to modify every B-25 they could get their hands on. By February 1943, there were 30 of Gunn's strafers ready. Then someone in Washington actually read the reports. Blueprints and photographs of the Australian B-25 conversions went to Wright Field in Ohio, where stateside engineers in clean uniforms and warm offices spread them on drafting tables. They stared at the added weight forward, at the turrets rotated off their designed arcs, at the field-welded cheek mounts. They studied the modifications for 3 days. Then a formal message went back across the Pacific. The modifications were impractical. The weight and balance were unsafe. The aircraft would not fly properly under combat conditions. Recommendation: ground every modified B-25 immediately. The message landed on Kenney's desk while he was in Washington. He walked into General Hap Arnold's office, where the Wright Field engineers were waiting with charts and graphs to explain why Pappy Gunn's gunship was impossible. Kenney didn't let them speak long. 12 of those impossible airplanes, he told Arnold flatly, have just played the key role in destroying a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every transport sunk. 60 more strafers are already being modified. Arnold, a practical man under his own layers of bureaucracy, practically ran the engineers out of his office. On paper, the gunship was impossible. Over the Bismarck Sea, reality was about to prove otherwise. From the Japanese side, Convoy 81 was just another lifeline. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, loaded with troops, equipment, and supplies to reinforce Lae and Salamaua on the New Guinea coast. If those garrisons held, they could threaten Port Moresby and slow or even halt MacArthur's advance. On February 28, 1943, they slipped out of Rabaul under overcast skies, bows cutting through the swells of the Bismarck Sea. Aboard one of the transports, Sergeant Tanaka Hiroshi, a deck gunner, checked the breech of his 25mm cannon and glanced up at the gray horizon. He'd sailed this route before. The briefings were always the same. American bombers might attack. The best defense was tight discipline and accurate fire. The gunners knew how to track high-altitude raids now. They knew the rhythm of bombs coming down from 10,000 feet. American B-17s and B-24s had hit convoys before, big silver shapes in tight formations, droning high where flak shells burst black all around them. The Japanese gunners had watched bombs tumble out, counted seconds, watched them splash into the sea, short or long. Sometimes a ship got hit. More often the convoy shrugged and steamed on. Low-level attacks were more frightening but rarer. A few A-20s and light bombers had tried them, popping over the waves, then climbing into murderous walls of tracer. Many had not survived. The convoy commander's staff officers believed they understood American doctrine. Medium bombers were used for proper level bombing. Fighters came lower, but couldn't carry heavy loads. If the Americans came, they'd be high and orderly, or they'd be suicidally low and few. In either case, the convoy's layered defenses, destroyers bristling with guns, transports with their own weapons, were expected to handle it. Tanaka had seen photographs of American B-25s in recognition manuals, twin-engine, high-wing, glass nose with bombardiers.
Yeah. Defensive guns in a dorsal turret and tail. Dangerous, certainly, but not terrifying. A known quantity. On March 2nd, Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy. Radio operators aboard the Japanese ships picked up increased chatter, but nothing they hadn't heard before. By late morning, high-altitude American bombers appeared, as predicted. They droned in at 7,000, 10,000 feet, delivered their bomb runs, and droned away amid disciplined flak. They caused some damage. A near miss here, a splintered deck planking there. Nothing critical. The men on deck relaxed a little. "If that is the worst we face, we will be in lie on schedule," one officer said on the bridge, confident. No one aboard those ships had yet seen what a B-25 looked like without its glass nose. No one had stood on a deck and watched a medium bomber come at them at 200 feet. Nose, solid metal and fire. Every gun on it pointed right at their faces. No one in the Imperial staff calculations had seriously planned for Allied bombers that could also shred a ship from bow to stern in one pass. When the next wave came in low out of the sun, some Japanese lookouts and gunners thought they were fighters at first. The shapes were blunt, fast, coming in on the deck, sunlight flashing off their wings. Then the first one rolled slightly, and Tanaka saw both engines, the big slab side and the nose. Not glass, but a dark, solid block with the cold, circular mouths of multiple guns. Before he could shout a warning, the air in front of his ship turned into a solid sheet of tracers. He swung his own weapon toward the lead attacker and felt his world disintegrate in a storm of metal. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't one single moment. It was 3 days of increasing violence, culminating in a few terrible hours where theory died under a hail of 50 caliber and skipping bombs. It began quietly, as most great battles do, with traffic analysis and code breakers. On February 28th, Allied cryptographers in Melbourne decrypted Japanese signals about a major convoy leaving Rabaul. Reconnaissance confirmed. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, heading toward Lai. General Kenney saw the opportunity immediately. For months, Gunn's modified B-25s had been training for this, practicing low-level approaches, skip bombing on derelict hulks, and perfecting the brutal choreography of the strafing run. Now, they had a target that mattered. On March 2nd, the first serious strikes went in. B-17s from higher altitude harassed and scattered the convoy, forcing ships to maneuver. They scored some hits, damaging a transport and a destroyer. But the main blow was scheduled for March 3rd, when weather and timing would allow the medium and light bombers to get in close. That morning, the sea lay under broken cloud. The Japanese convoy, believing it had weathered the worst, reformed and pushed on. At 10 a.m., Allied Beaufighters of the RAAF came in low, raking the destroyers and transports with cannon and machine gun fire, forcing the Japanese to close their AA batteries' blast shields and divert fire. Minutes later, the B-25s arrived. Gunn's 3rd Attack Group strafers led in at masthead height. They came in line abreast, not the tight bomber boxes of altitude doctrine, but a sawtooth of toothy noses barely above the waves. Pappy's own aircraft, bristling with 14 guns, was among them. At 500 feet out, the ship's flak finally got its range. Streams of tracers stitched the air. Some shots were wild, aimed too high. Others came uncomfortably close. Puffs of flak burst a cool head, throwing up walls of black bursting shrapnel. The gunship crews had trained for this moment. As soon as the first tracer lines reached out, they opened up. From the Japanese decks, it looked like the horizon had turned to fire. The lead B-25s poured streams of 50 caliber into each ship's bow guns, walking the impacts back across the forecastle, splintering crew, mounts, and ready ammunition. Secondary explosions took some positions out entirely. As the bowfighters strafed along the ship's beams, the Mitchells came in head-on, creating a murderous crossfire. The Japanese gunners, brave and disciplined, fought back as best they could. Some B-25s took hits. One Mitchell lost an engine and, spewing smoke, staggered over a destroyer at mast height, its own guns still firing until it cartwheeled into the sea. Another came back with holes you could put your head through in the wings. But the majority punched through. Gunn's bomb release over that huge transport was one of dozens. Across the convoy, B-25 crews timed their runs so that bombs hit seconds apart. 400 and 500-pounders skipped off the surface like deadly stones, slamming into hulls at or just above the waterline. Some went under before detonating, blowing huge plumes out of the ship's sides. Others burst within holds, touching off cargo and fuel. Transport staggered, slowed, and began to burn. One hit amidships, shuddered from bow to stern and snapped its back, folding into a V of twisted steel. Another rolled over slowly, screws still thrashing air as the keel came up and men leapt into flaming water. Destroyers tried to throw up smoke screens and maneuver between the attackers and the fat transports. It only made them targets, too. In passes, lasting only seconds, the B-25 strafers transformed the orderly convoy into a ring of fire and wreckage. For 3 days, the attacks continued. When visibility allowed, Allied aircraft were overhead. Bowfighters, A-20s, B-25s, even fighters diving in to strafe lifeboats, and barges trying to escape with troops. It was a ruthless, total effort. Japanese commanders tried to press on, then to withdraw, then simply to save what they could. It wasn't enough. By the end, all 8 transports were sunk or burning out. 4 destroyers were sunk or fatally damaged. Of roughly 6,900 troops embarked, thousands died. Many who got off the ships drowned or were cut down as they tried to reach shore. For the price of a handful of aircraft, the Allies had obliterated a convoy that represented months of Japanese planning and irreplaceable resources. In the official tallies, the B-25 strafers' contribution was clear. Their low-level attacks and skip-bombing runs had turned theory into a massacre. For Pappy Gunn, it was proof stamped in saltwater, tortilla, and flame. His impossible gunships had just helped kill 12 ships in 3 days. Back in Australia, when the crews finally landed and staggered out of their aircraft, some kissed the oil-streaked fuselage. Others simply slumped against the landing gear, too wired and exhausted for words. They had flown through a wall of fire in machines the engineers said would not fly properly. They had come back. The ships they'd gone to kill had not. News of the Bismarck Sea victory moved fast. In communiques, the language was dry. Convoy destroyed. Heavy losses inflicted. The photographs that came back with the reconnaissance aircraft told the real story. Ships broken in half, oil fires stretching for miles, lifeboats adrift amid floating wreckage. In squadron tents and mess halls, the talk was not of communiques but of guns. How many forward did you have up? Did the cheek guns jam? How close did you get before you dropped? Crews compared hole counts and gun camera film. Armorers bragged about which installations had stood up under the heaviest recoil. Mechanics cursed and marveled at wings ragged with flak, but still attached. The gunship, once an oddity, now had an undeniable combat record. In Washington, when Kenney told General Arnold that 12 of the impossible airplanes had helped wipe out a convoy, the Wright Field engineers' objections withered under the weight of hard results. Before long, North American was incorporating some of Gunn's ideas into factory-built variants. The B-25G and H models carried heavy forward armament, including even a 75mm cannon in some versions. Later B-25J models sported 8 fixed 50s in the nose, with more in side packs and turrets, gunships right off the production line. What had begun as field modifications in a hot, muddy depot at Townsville became standard issue. In doctrinal manuals, phrases like masthead height attacks and skip bombing appeared. Training films showed bombers skimming waves, bombs skipping into hulks. Gunn's improvisations were codified, polished, and taught to fresh crews. The logic, overwhelming a target with forward-firing guns, turning a transport or truck column into a chew toy for a flying gun platform, echoed down through later wars. In Korea and Vietnam, gunships bore different names and flew different airframes, but their DNA track led back to that Pacific improvisation. A-26 Invaders with banks of fixed guns, then AC-47 Spooky, and ultimately AC-130 circling targets and hosing them with fire. Somewhere in that lineage sat the mental picture of a B-25 with no bombardier's glass, just a wall of steel barrels and ammo feed chutes, thundering in at point-blank range. As for Pappy Gunn himself, his war didn't end with Bismarck Sea. He kept pushing aircraft and ideas past where the manuals said they should stop. He was wounded later in the war, survived, and returned to a world that never quite understood what he'd done in those chaotic early years. He never forgot why he'd been willing to gamble so hard. His wife and children, twisted up in one of the war's cruelties, survived their time in Japanese captivity and were eventually reunited with him. It was a miracle measured against the odds he'd seen other families face. Years later, in a quiet hangar or small museum somewhere in the States, a boy might stand under the dark belly of a preserved B-25J, staring up at the clustered muzzles in its nose. "Why does it have so many guns?" he'd ask. An older man, maybe a volunteer guide, maybe a veteran with white hair and oil scars he still couldn't quite wash away, would smile faintly. "Because once upon a time," he'd say, "there was a guy in Australia who looked at what we had and said, 'It isn't enough, not for what we're asking these boys to do.' And instead of writing a report, he went and got a welding torch. He might tell the boy a little about Eagle Farm, and about Townsville, and about the way bombers turned into strafers over New Guinea. He might mention the Bismarck Sea, and how 12 Japanese ships never made landfall because some impossible airplanes came in too low and too angry to ignore. He probably wouldn't talk much about the arguments in Washington or the engineers who'd tried to ground those planes. Time had sanded those edges away. But for the men who had flown into walls of tracer, with their hands crushing the triggers of those nose guns, the memory remained sharp. The shock of recoil, the smell of burnt powder, the glimpse of a transport's bridge disappearing under a sheet of sparks. In war, the line between folly and innovation is often written in blood. Pappy Gunn's B-25 gunship crossed that line at 200 feet, guns screaming, bombs skipping, in a place where theory said it couldn't fly, and 12 ships died in 3 days to prove that it could. Long after the wrecks rusted into the seabed of the Bismarck Sea, the idea endured. When the old ways aren't killing the enemy fast enough, someone in the mud and the heat will bolt more guns onto the nose and try again. And sometimes the thing the engineers call impossible becomes the new standard.